New Orleans Saints' new defensive coordinator, Brandon Staley, may finally change the Saints' edge rusher prototype. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media, covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net, and Saints analyst with WWL TV. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, the Saints defensive tackle spots and the defensive line face the most question marks with the upcoming changes on their side of the football. We got three defensive backs who have a chance to watch their game completely change in 2025. And to kick us all off, defensive coordinator Brandon Staley, the new hire for the New Orleans Saints, could be bringing about a long-awaited change at edge rusher for the Saints defense. We got all that and much more for you on today's show. Whether it's your first time or your next time, we appreciate you very much for making us your first listener, for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by friends over at FanDuel. You can get $150 in bonus bets by simply winning your first $5 bet. Just head over to FanDuel.com today to get started. New Orleans Saints' new defensive coordinator, Brandon Staley, could potentially and finally bring about one of the most long-awaited changes that the New Orleans Saints defense has yet to make, that Saints fans have been wanting for quite some time, and that is the involvement, the investment, the reliance upon the speed edge rusher. Yes, we are entering speed edge rusher era, everyone. It seems that will be the case here with Brandon Staley, just based on what he's been successful with in the past, looking at guys like Leonard Floyrd and Khalil Mack in Chicago, and then, of course, Leonard Floyrd and Samson Ebukam over with the Los Angeles Rams. You can add in a little bit of Michael Brockers in there, who played a little bit more five tech, but he has the agility, the ability to be kind of that athletic pass rusher. And then, of course, what he was able to get done with Bosa and Mack and others over with the Los Angeles Chargers as well, even though the Chargers years weren't as exciting as his years as the outside linebackers coach with the Chicago Bears under Vic Fangio, and then his year as a defensive coordinator with the Los Angeles Rams. But the idea here is that since he doesn't have to split focus and be head coach with one side of the brain and defensive coordinator with the other side of the brain, that maybe him just prevailing over a defense and focusing on a defense again will allow him to be able to kind of get the most out of these players. And one of the ways that he gets the most out of these players is by bringing in what it is that he likes, right? And bringing in players that fit that mold. For a long time now, the New Orleans Saints quintessential edge defender mold has been 6'4", 6'5", or above, 270, 280 pound, big bodied, speed to power conversion guys, a lot of physical focus, a lot of size focus, whereas the rest of the NFL, not really the rest of the NFL, but the majority of the NFL has since gone over to a different couple of traits when it comes to edge rushers, and that's been speed and athleticism, agility, explosiveness, all of those things. That has kind of been the trend of the edge rusher around the NFL. And the Saints have kind of been not necessarily behind the curve. It's just that that's not been their focus over on the defensive side. They've had guys that fit that mold. Caden Ellis, former linebacker, now with the Atlanta Falcons, kind of stepped into that role late a few years ago, and then had a solid season, and then got a starting linebacker role in Atlanta, so left New Orleans. Zach Bond, of course, was drafted out of Wisconsin. He was a speed rusher at Wisconsin, 12.5 sacks. It's a thing that made him draftable. He landed here in New Orleans in Dennis Allen's system. There was no such role that replicated his strength in Wisconsin, so instead they tried to turn him into an off-ball linebacker. That never really panned out. And then they finally kind of put him into more of a hybrid role. And then he started to find some success, both as a pass rusher and then developed in coverage. Went over to Vic Fangio's system with the Philadelphia Eagles. And then all of a sudden, he was a defensive player of the year finalist, one of the most disruptive, I almost said destructive, I guess both are true, players in the NFL, wreaking havoc all over the place and everything. Of course, had a fantastic Super Bowl game that everybody got to see. That guy used to play in the Superdome wearing black and gold, but wasn't doing that because he wasn't asked to, right? So now all of a sudden you have a Vic Fangio-esque system, right? Certainly some changes that are made to be specific to the person that's calling those plays. That now is Brandon Staley coming here to New Orleans. And one of the things that remains true of his defense is stand up pass rushing. Stand up, outside, wide 9, if you will, which means outside of what we would call the 9 gap, which is just like your tackle tight end and then outside the tight end, right? So being able to win with bend, run the arc, all those other things to try to get to the quarterback as quickly as possible, applying pressure in that way. And that's something that Brandon Staley has done well. The Rams led the NFL in sacks in 2020 when he was the defensive coordinator there. And a lot of people are going to say, well, yeah, they had a defensive player of the year season out of Aaron Donald, which is very true. But they also got 10.5 sacks out of Leonard Floyrd, who was on like another team at that point. And so I think that you look at where the Saints can find some value here with Brandon Staley, and will it work? Won't it work? We don't know yet. But as I've said in the past, or as I said in some other moments where I've been able to discuss this, I'd rather watch the Saints fail because they tried something new when it didn't work than failed doing the same thing that has failed over and over again over the course of the last few years. And this is an example of that. I'd rather see the New Orleans Saints take some kind of shot at a change of approach and to see if it works. And then if it does, fantastic. They made the right choice. If it doesn't, well, hey, at least they tried something different, as opposed to sticking with kind of the stubborn nature of like, no, this is the brand of sport we play, right? Because it's that, the idea of stubbornness is not limited to the NFL. You see it in the NBA, you see it everywhere. And so at least the Saints aren't doing that. And so I like the fact that Staley has the chance to change that edge rusher fit, that edge rusher role. That is, and to be clear, the role, or rather the system defines the roles. The prototypes are established no matter what, right? So if you're looking for a speed rusher, the big-bodied 6'5", 280-pound, 270-pound pass rusher is not the prototype for that speed rusher role. So the Saints are very aware still of what works as a speed rusher. You've got James Pearce Jr. in the first round, Mike Green potentially in the first round, Adam Marshall. You've got guys like Donovan Ezeiruaku who can go down to the second round. Even Princely Umanmielen, who represents a little bit of an in-between when it comes to all that. Then you can look even later in the draft, David Walker out of Central Arkansas and others. There are these players out there that will be able to be had and could come in and be contributors right away as speed rushers in this system. And so the Saints aren't going to miss out on those players because, oh, you want speed rushers? Well, we like the big 6'5" plus 280, so we'll draft that guy for you to use as a speed rusher. That's not going to be the case. The role will define the prototype, and the prototype is based on the role. So if the role is speed rusher, stand-up edge rusher around the edge, there's a different prototype for that than maybe one of those like run-stopping edge defenders that we've seen the Saints invest in quite a bit over the course of the last few years. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see the Saints investing here. I wouldn't be surprised to see guys like Isaiah Foskey and Carl Granderson get those opportunities as well. Those are roles that they played during their collegiate years, and maybe that helps to reignite some things for them. But I do think that outside investment is still of value for New Orleans when it comes to this position. But if nothing else, it's a change. And it's a change that is very welcome and has been very, very much asked for here in New Orleans for quite some time. Coming up next, there are 3 defensive backs whose games just changed. I'll tell you all about it as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, and our official sports betting partners here on the Locked On Podcast Network. FanDuel is awesome, especially all throughout the NBA season. Sometimes you don't get an opportunity to get that money line or that spread before the game tips off, but that's okay because they have all these live betting features that you can still get in on who's going to score the most. You can even go down to like quarters and predicting quarters and calling quarters and things like that. You can even dive into fourth quarter comebacks. I mean, there's a ton, plus moving lines, live money lines, all that you can get on as well. And right now, new customers over at FanDuel can get $150 in bonus bets by simply winning your first $5 bet. That's over at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com for your chance at $150 in bonus bets. Put $5 down tonight on the Philadelphia 76ers, who are 11-point favorites over the Brooklyn Nets. If you win that money line, bang, you end up getting $150 in bonus bets as a new customer over at FanDuel, where you can make every moment more with the official sports betting partners of the NBA. All right, family. 3 New Orleans Saints defensive backs games just changed with the hire of Brandon Staley as a New Orleans Saints defensive coordinator. Alontae Taylor, Kool-Aid McKinstry, second-year corner out of Alabama, drafted in the second round last year, and veteran defensive back Tyrann Mathieu. I think all 3 of those players very likely just saw their games change for the better with Brandon Staley taking the reins of the defense. I actually want to start with Alontae Taylor. Alontae Taylor has already taken to social media. He actually did this on, IG Live, where he was talking about the Kellen Moore hire. He posted a thing up saying, like, we want 40 a game and all this other stuff. It's really cool to just kind of see how engaged he's been in the coaching searches and what's going on with the team and all those other things. There are other players of much higher status that you haven't heard anything from over the course of the offseason when it comes to coaching hires and things like that have kind of raised eyebrows for fans. But Alontae Taylor has been locked in. A lot of the defensive guys actually have been. And some of the offensive guys too, like we've seen from Rashid Shaheed, we've seen Eric McCoy at the facility, all these other things. And so it's just kind of cool to see that and Alontae Taylor being in that number. But this is a guy that started off really strong outside, playing on the perimeter, playing on the boundary during his rookie year. Ended up moving inside at one point during 2023, and then ended up moving back outside again. And played very well on the outside, on the boundary, and on the perimeter in 2023. Then in 2024, embraced that new slot position, and then all of a sudden took off in 2024. Looked great. Getting pressure on the quarterback, tackles for a loss, making plays behind the line of scrimmage, forcing fumbles, run stops, graded out great as a run defender from the slot. And then all of a sudden, after Paulson Adebo's injury, as well as the trade of Marshawn Lattimore, we saw Alontae Taylor get bounced back outside. And then once that happened, I mean, you change a guy's role 6 times in 3 years, things are going to be a little tough for him. And so I think that things got a little tough for him. And so you didn't see the same level of production on the outside that you saw on the inside and everything. And I think that now his game changes again, but changes for the better. One of the things that he posted on social media, I won't say the quote directly, but he said, just unleash me, and basically said, I'm going to make blank happen. And a part of that is, what role he's going to serve in this Brandon Staley defense. And I think he is a shoo-in for Brandon Staley's star position, the Vic Fangio star position. We've seen it at Florida. It was what C.J. Gardner-Johnson played when he was at Florida, for instance. It was what Jalen Ramsey played when he was at Florida State. It was the role that Jalen Ramsey played in the slot in 2020 in that Los Angeles Rams defense, where everybody kind of goes, well, he had, Brandon Staley had a great defense, but he also had an all-pro season out of Jalen Ramsey. Yeah, he got an all-pro season out of Jalen Ramsey, asking him to do something different in the system, in the NFL. And so I think that's worth highlighting. And I think Alontae Taylor could be somebody that would be maximizing that position as well. The star position is effectively a slot cornerback / hybrid safety position. Think of it as like a or nickel linebacker almost. That is somebody that contributes in the run game, contributes as a pass rusher, contributes in making sure that you're evening out the numbers in the run game as well to make sure you're still getting that 7-man front, even if you've got 3 defensive linemen and 3 linebackers on the field, one of which being a pass rusher. Then all of a sudden that's a 6-man front, but then you have that slot hybrid corner safety that can play down and bear down and do all the things that he needs to do to be able to change the numbers and still have a 7-man front. That's a place where Alontae Taylor has looked more and more comfortable. He was great in run defense last year. He was really, really good. I know that some of the tackling away from the line of scrimmage is what everybody remembers, but the reason why you don't remember the missed tackles close to the line of scrimmage is because he didn't miss a lot of those. Playing to his strength, his tenacity, his aggressiveness, all those other things that all worked out. That's what the star position would do. So I think Alontae Taylor's role may have just changed, assuming that the Saints find another outside corner to pair with Kool-Aid McKinstry, allowing them to be able to move Alontae Taylor back into the slot to play that hybrid role, that star role. I think that fits him and his play style, his attitude, his confidence, fits all of that really, really well. So we'll see which way things go for him there. But hopefully just whatever they ask Alontae to do at the beginning of the year in week 1, I hope is the same thing, in fairness to him, that he's asked to do at the end in week 18, because consistently changing his roles partway through the season and then pointing at him and going, well, he's struggling. I wonder why. I wonder why. I mean, this is the coaching thing all over again, right? That we saw with Zach Bond, that we saw with Caden Ellis, that we saw with others, not being placed where you're at your strength. This would be an opportunity to place him where he's at his strength. Being placed at his strength, by the way, Kool-Aid McKinstry, 100%. Kool-Aid McKinstry is a natural fit for this defense. Natural fit. It is the same type of communication, maybe different language, we'll see, but same type of communication, very similar types of rules and guidelines in terms of how to shadow certain coverages and adjust to certain releases by wide receivers at the line of scrimmage and everything with this kind of rip-liz, pattern matching defense. This is right up Kool-Aid McKinstry's alley. It's exactly what he did with Nick Saban when he was with the Alabama Crimson Tide before he was drafted to New Orleans. That's huge. I think that's going to be really good for him. And he was already looking good and getting better and better and better throughout the 2024 season. Now he gets placed in what should be a super familiar defense to him. And I think Dennis Allen's defense was pretty familiar to him as well. But this is going to feel like day and day or night and night. There's no night and day and night when it comes to this one. Day and day or night and night would be the worst Kid Cudi song ever, by the way. Day and night, too classic. But like, you have to look at Kool-Aid McKinstry and go, oh man, I assume he's incredibly excited about what his fit is about to be in this defense as an outside boundary corner. Like, it should be him and somebody else on the outside. Maybe Paulson Adebo gets brought back. Would certainly love to see him back here in New Orleans. A guy that I know gets a lot of flags, gets a lot of attention because of the jersey that he wears sometimes, but he has been outstanding. And he would be a good fit in this defense as well because of the physicality, the intelligence you have to play with, understanding the rules and the guidelines. Like, Paulson Adebo just gets all those things. He plays with technique. He doesn't rely on natural skill. He can rely on natural skill because he has it when he needs it, but he follows what it is that's being set before him in terms of following the fundamentals, breaking down his foundation, all those other things, relying on his foundation. I think those are all good things, and those are things that are going to be important in a Brandon Staley defense, which is going to have a lot of rules, but you got to be able to follow them. And if you can, man, guys like Kool-Aid McKinstry, Paulson Adebo, huge. All right, so I threw in a little bit of land yep there on Paulson Adebo, sorry. ESPN article, by the way, came out not too long ago about best fit for Paulson Adebo, and they said the New Orleans Saints was the only Saints team, or only Saints fit, or in like the top 50 free agents. But so there's already some expectation, at least nationally, that, yeah, that's a real possibility. So we'll see where things go there. Finally, Tyrann Mathieu. I think Tyrann Mathieu being able to play a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage, play that cover 6 safety role where he gets to crash down a little bit, play that underneath kind of midfield zone where he can be, a potential like robber. And I think he even campaigned for more robber roles last year. And all of a sudden they gave him to him and he almost picked off like 3 passes in a game because of using those roles. And so I think that's a big one. And then also him being the safety that has the ability to crash down. Remember, I talked about with Alontae Taylor, you can have him be that 7th guy in the box. Sometimes he can't be because he's got a cover or because a certain release happens at the line of scrimmage, like whatever it might be. Sometimes you need that safety to come down and give you that 7th man in the box. And Tyrann would be a great player to do that, playing closer to the line of scrimmage, playing a little bit more of a downhill version of Derwin James and like a Taylor wrap role. I really like that in this Brandon Staley defense. So I think all 3 of those guys, Kool-Aid McKinstry, Alontae Taylor, and Tyrann Mathieu, just saw their games get changed, potentially for the better, ideally for the better, here under Brandon Staley. We'll see what that actually translates to in 2025. Coming up next, the New Orleans Saints defensive line has some major questions, especially those in the defensive interior, and the addition of Brandon Staley just makes those questions even larger. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints defensive line already had some questions, but now those question marks loom even larger with the addition of Brandon Staley, particularly on the interior of the defensive line. This New Orleans Saints roster is built to be an even man front, a traditional 3-tech defensive tackle that lines up a little bit further away from the center, lines up between the guard and the tackle to be sort of the interior penetrator, be that sort of pass rusher role there. And then there were these guys that played some 1-tech or 0-tech, 1-tech being lining up on the shoulder, the outside shoulder, either one of the center, kind of in between the center and the guard. And in 0-tech being like, you and I are looking at each other nose to nose, face to face. I'm the center, you're the defensive tackle. That makes you a 0-tech. And so those zeros, those numbers just represent gaps, 0, 1, 3, There's two eyes, stuff like that. So there's just like different gaps along the defensive line. Once we circle back to midweek fundamentals here over the offseason, we'll break some of those down. But that's a general kind of quick look at all of it. We'll actually define a couple more here today as we go through. But that roster build, doesn't necessarily fit what Brandon Staley's defense might be, right? We don't really know just yet if Brandon Staley's going to come in and say, all right, we're a 3-4 defense now, and then just like turn it all around. It might be more like, hey, I'd like to start implementing some more odd man fronts, a few more of these 3-man fronts instead of just utilizing them on third downs, which is when the Saints usually utilize them. They used what's called an Okie front, where you had that nose tackle, that zero tech that we just talked about, 2 defensive ends over on the outside, 2 linebackers that were kind of on either shoulder, either side of that defensive tackle in the middle of the defense, and then 2 safeties on the outside of the defensive end. So it gave the look of a 7-man line, but then some would drop back into coverage, some would rush. It wasn't always the same. It's a good disguised look, but Saints typically use that 3-man front on third downs in obvious passing situations. Brandon Staley might want to use that as a run base. You know what I mean? So we'll see exactly how quickly things begin to change. And it might be introduce a little bit of it in 2025 and then really overhaul it in 2026. It might be, no, we're doing this now. It might be incremental between 2025, 2026, 2026, 2027, like whatever it might be and everything. So, it might not all happen right away, but the questions will loom. And the question that looms largest right now for the defensive interior is who works? Who fits? What you're typically looking for when you've got a nose tackle, zero tech type of plug the middle of the defense role, you're typically looking for a guy that's, 6 foot and above. I really don't care too much about height when it comes to defensive tackle. Actually, kind of the shorter guys get good leverage sometimes, depending upon the size of the centers and all these other things. But I think some people would probably say 6'3" or above, but we've seen some really successful nose tackles that weren't necessarily that. So nose tackle and zero tech, by the way, interchangeable phrases. And so you think about like a Malcolm Brown. He's always my favorite example for the New Orleans Saints, but he was 6'2", but he was 320 plus pounds. He was a big dude that changed the numbers in the defense because he would take up 2 offensive linemen on the interior, which created one-on-one opportunities that were pass rushing elsewhere. That's a key element of this. You look at, Tyler Davison was probably a really good example too, back 2015 through 2018, probably during his rookie contract before he went over to Atlanta. But he was like a little bit over 6 foot, and he was only like 309, but he just carried his weight. So he just distributed his weight so well and knew how to utilize the leverage and all these other things. And he actually played that role pretty well. Malcolm Roach played that role pretty well also. I think if you go back to the Bears, you're probably looking at like Eddie Goldman, was that his name? I think is probably the best example there, to where he was 323, 6'4", just a big freaking dude that took up and ate up a lot of space on the interior that created space for other guys. And so I think you got to figure out who that guy is. Maybe the most readily available player to potentially be that could be Khalen Saunders, 6 foot, 320 plus, 324, I think. But the thing about Khalen Saunders is that like his athleticism at his size might make you not necessarily want to utilize him there because you don't want to pigeonhole him to a role where you're not taking advantage of his athleticism. And one of the things that the Saints have not done very well since he arrived here in New Orleans is take advantage of his athleticism and let him play to his core strength. And so that might be a role that the Saints have to fill. Free agency, Teair Tart, who played that role, a similar role for the Los Angeles Chargers last year, which of course was not an overlap with Brandon Staley. Staley was assistant head coach for the San Francisco 49ers during that time. Or you go to the draft, right? Alfred Collins out of Texas. Kentucky, Jalon Walker is another big one. 6'7", 340 pounds. Yeah, put him in the middle of a defense and let him eat everything up. Like, yeah, 100%. Big time. Jordan Phillips coming out of Maryland plays that role pretty well too. So there are the guys that they can do that with, but it's just going to be interesting to see how do they build it? What do they do with the guys that are currently in the building? And then beyond that at defensive tackle, who are the guys that if you go to a 3-man front, you're typically looking at guys that are like the defensive ends that are more edge defenders as opposed to pass rushers. You use those guys on the outside typically. And so those other like 3-4 defensive ends, kind of the Cam Jordan types, right? 6'4", 6'5", 270 something, 260 something pounds, everything like that, like 280 plus, like that type of edge defender, right? And now you wonder, okay, who on the interior could potentially bounce outside, quote unquote, to play that kind of 5-tech role? And one guy that immediately comes to mind is Bryan Bresee. I think Bryan Bresee could do that in a heartbeat because you're taking a lot of inside shade paths. You're doing kind of, I figured out the phrase, I was trying to explain the gap and then some role that they play in run fits where your responsibility isn't just one gap, but it's also not two gaps. It's a gap and a little more. It's called a gap and a half defense. Thank you to the commenters for helping me out with that one. But yeah, it's a gap and a half defense, which is like a legitimate thing. See it in every level of football. To where like my responsibility might be the A gap, but I'm also peeping what's going on in like the B gap. My arm might be a little extended out that way to make sure that like if the guy next to me that is the B gap has to play into the C gap, that I can move over the B gap, so on and so forth. And so like you kind of play a gap and a half technically. And so a guy like Bryan Bresee, I could see doing that. But can a Nathan Shepard do that? You know, Christian Boyd actually is another good example of somebody that could be a nose tackle for you now that I think about it. And everything like that. So the defensive interior, I think, has some of the biggest question marks. And in those defensive ends, it's like, okay, so can you play that 5-tech, 3-4 defensive end? Or can you slim down and then move to the outside like an Isaiah Foskey, like a Carl Granderson, who played those stand-up pass rusher roles in their college careers? So it's just going to be really interesting to kind of see where the answers are yes, where the answers are no. If you had Christian Boyd plugging up, like if I'm just using who's immediately on the roster, Christian Boyd plugging up the middle, your 2-3-4 defensive ends being Cam Jordan and Bryan Bresee, your stand-up outside pass rushers, Isaiah Foskey and Carl Granderson, and then your two inside linebackers that are basically your coverage guys, but also your downhill run defenders, Demario Davis and Pete Werner. Like I can see some of that working. So we'll see. You know, we'll see where things go, but I think you're also really looking to add talent there. Like especially in this year's draft, we have so much defensive tackle talent, so much edge rusher talent. Have to look at that for sure. All right, coming up next, or coming up in tomorrow's show, linebackers. What do we really believe will be the case now for guys like Pete Werner, Demario Davis, Nephi Sewell, and others? Who fits, who doesn't fit? Could Willie Gay Jr. be back? All those other things. Does he fit in this scheme? We'll take a look at it based on the prototypes of who Brandon Staley has found success with at that linebacker position in tomorrow's Sunday show. Remember, we're 7 days a week here on Locked On Saints. We appreciate you very much. Making us your first listen. For your second listen, go and check out Locked On NFL Draft. Damian and Keith. Keith's a Saints fan, by the way, so at least go show him some love. But Damian and Keith do a phenomenal job breaking down all these prospects, giving you rankings, mock drafts, their prospect breakdowns, all that flawless. They're excellent. So go and check them out over at Locked On NFL Draft. Especially with the combine upcoming, don't want to miss it. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listener, for being an everyday here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. What am I doing? I didn't do the right outro. I'm going to do that again, but I'm just going to keep this rolling. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.